Dr. Honeydew and I are going to talk a little bit about, this is going to be super exciting. We had talked about, the other time we talked about reliability, which of course was about, can our measuring stick actually measure what it says it measures? Now we're going to talk about the two V's, the double V's. Some call it double U's, but actually it's only in Germany. The two V's. Variation and validity. We have to make sure that our tool creates actual variation in the real world, and then we've got to make sure that that variation in the real world validly relates to something else in the real world. So variation, what is that? That basically says if I've built an instrument to measure, I don't know, to measure potential, I can say, well, I want to measure potential in Kevin. Can I actually design a set of questions that when people answer them about Kevin, we get range? It's actually pretty tricky that. If you're not careful, you'll ask a question like, I think Kevin has potential, scale of 1 to 5. And you end up with a question where everybody answering that question says 4 or 5. Most of the questions that we ask actually produce no variation. People sit around and they'll think, well, because I want to measure an issue like potential, I should just be able to come up with a list of questions that I think relate to potential. But unfortunately, most of the questions you come up with don't create any variation to them. I'll give you an example. Trust. We might think, well, we want to measure trust on a team, let's say. I should be able just to come up with a question like, I trust my coworkers. And then that's a good question to measure trust. Actually, it turns out it isn't, because you get no variation with that question. So if everybody says 4 or 5. When I was at Gallup, we would continue to just grind and grind and grind to find what is the right question that somehow is phrased just right. That when you ask people that question, you do get variation in how people answer that question. In fact, that's where we came up with the question, I have a best friend at work. That's a tough question. You get range because you got the word best in there. You get range. Some people say strongly agree. Some people say strongly disagree. You've created a question that's worded so precisely, it creates range. Most of the employee survey questions that you participate in, most of the 360 survey questions you participate in, if you really looked under the hood, you'd find there's no variation to them. So, when you're building any kind of survey tool, any kind of measurement tool, you've got to make sure you've worded the questions just right to create variation. That's tricky. It's an art. You've got to keep trying it, playing around with it. When you do that, and you've created basically a question or a series of questions that create variation, your next question is, all right, well, does the variation that I've created actually relate to something that is valid in the real world? Stated more simply, do the people who answer strongly agree to that question end up doing something in the real world that's more productive? Some sort of behavior that I want. Do they stay longer, deliver better service, create better products, make fewer mistakes? Is the thing that I'm measuring actually predicting something in the real world? This is called, I'm going to write all these 3 words out because you've got to ask about it, criterion related validity. Validity, there you go. Criterion related validity. I've got a dial over here that I've made. It's a dial. And I'm measuring people on this dial. Let's say I'm asking about employee engagement questions. And I've got a pointer here that's pointing, and the pointer reveals engagement. So let's say this is measuring employee engagement. I've then got another dial over here that measures employee turnover. Validity, criterion-related validity, means that these 2 dials match. If this one goes up, 3 months later, employee turnover. Shoot. Okay, we're going to call that retention just to make sure this is easier for us all to understand. When employee engagement goes up, retention goes up. Or if employee engagement goes up, let's say I was measuring productivity, that productivity would go up. These dials have to match. In fact, we don't just want them to match at the same time, where this one goes up at the same time this one goes up. We actually want to measure that this one predicts this one. That at time 1, this goes up. At time 2, does this go up? That's what we're trying to get at. We're trying to prove that we are measuring something so useful and so accurately, so reliably at time 1, that it predicts someone's behavior at time 2. So when somebody says, is your tool valid? What they're really asking is, at time 1, when this moves up, at time 2, does this move up? This is behavior in the real world. It's the most exacting kind of validity. If you can show that you've got a tool that measures something at time 1 that predicts actual behavior at time 2, you have a wicked, valid measurement tool. Virtually no 360 tools have anything like this kind of validity. Very few employee opinion surveys have anything like this kind of validity. What you may sometimes hear, and this is getting, time out, just a tiny bit inside baseball. What some of you will hear a lot of is called driver analysis. Driver analysis is like the little itty bitty baby step of this kind of criterion validity. Driver analysis is basically, you've got an employee opinion survey with, say, 70 questions in it. 2 of the questions right at the end are sort of summary questions like, overall I'm very satisfied, or overall I would be proud to recommend my company to friends and family. Sort of summary questions. And then you just correlate the other 68 questions to the 2. And you see whether or not some of the 68 drive the overall summary questions a little more powerfully. And you go, oh look, here are the 20 best of the 68. Actually, that's not criterion-related validity. You're not relating questions in a survey to actual behavior in the real world. You're just rating or examining the relationship between some questions in a survey to other 2 questions in a survey. It's like a little sneaky way of doing some kind of validity analysis. Don't be swayed by it. When you hear driver analysis, alarm bells should go off in your mind going, invalid, 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 invalid. What real validity is what I'm measuring at time 1, does it predict something real in the real world at time 2? That's criterion-related validity, and it's the most exacting kind of validity that you can possibly expose your tool to. If you've got a tool with criterion-related validity, you've got a good tool that's yielding valuable data that matters in the real world.